This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals, the podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. If you're not familiar with the Animal Politics series, you definitely should be. It's a collection of books about animal studies from a range of disciplinary directions. The series is currently accepting proposals, so if you're working on a book about animals, you should consider sending it their way. One thing that's particularly good about the series is that the books are much cheaper than typical academic books, and that's really good news for both authors and for readers. Now, I met today's guest through our shared connection with the Vegan Society. Indeed, today's guest has hosted the Vegan Society's biannual research day twice. And I'm particularly excited to welcome him to the podcast because I'm always keen to feature people who are introducing animal studies or questions about animals to new parts of the academic world. And that's one of the things that this guest has been doing over the last few years. Dr. Jack Waverley is a senior lecturer in fashion marketing in the Department of Materials at the University of Manchester here in the United Kingdom. His academic background is in marketing and consumer research, and he's interested in exploring how these disciplines can promote the interests of all animals and not just humans. Today, we're going to discuss his article, Organs or Bodies, Toward an Equitable, Embodied and Animal-Inclusive Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Agenda, which appeared open access in the journal Consumption, Markets and Culture in 2024. Welcome to the podcast, Jack.
Thank you for having me.
Can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
I've come to the topic of animals and knowing animals from a kind of long-winded, convoluted, circuitous route. And the way that I really came to understand how important animals were in markets and consumption was through EDI-type topics. Originally, my PhD focused on gender, sexuality, race, disability, typical human differences and inequities and injustices. And through studying human to human hierarchies, I became sensitized to the hierarchy between humans and non-humans. But that was very much outside of my discipline and very much outside of my own personal interests. But around the same time, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the paper specifically, I became really interested in post-human philosophies, philosophers like Deleuze, for example, or Donna Haraway. And through ideas like actor network theory, assemblage, figurations, I became more open-minded to the humans, non-humans, inhumans, out of humans, these kind of boundaries that we draw. And originally, I was very much using them for understanding human-to-human relationships, but understanding how objects and places can influence those. So the non-human agency was very inanimate, shall we say. But that very much opened me up to thinking about animals. And then kind of in my personal life, completely separately, or at least seemingly separately, I was moving on my journey from vegetarianism to veganism. And when those two things dovetailed together, I very much realized that ignoring the animate non-humans around us, in theory and in practice, was a big problem. So all of that led to this paper because I had kind of been primed by the EDI discourse in terms of thinking about human EDI issues, so human equity, diversity and inclusion. And then in my personal and professional life, beginning to think about these more than human, post-human, inhuman theories. And bringing all that together, I thought, well, there must be people out there talking about this. There must be people talking about how animals are part of inequitable systems, how animals are excluded, how they're marginalized, how their differences aren't thought about. And of course, in animal studies, in all sorts of disciplines, there are many people thinking about these kinds of issues. but not necessarily using the terminology of EDI, or in America, DEI is the common acronym. At first, I felt like maybe this is just two different kinds of terminology and there's not really any need to reinvent the wheel or to kind of rebrand old wine. But the more I looked into this, the more I felt that as a business scholar, as a marketing scholar, the DEI, EDI acronym is really, really popular and it's very well established and it's very legitimized within the corporate world, within organizations. And so tapping into that and exploring the tensions was something that I thought would be really, really very interesting to do. And that was the genesis of this paper. And I think one thing to really talk about, and we get this a lot when I talk about my research, is when I introduce myself as a marketing and consumer researcher, I think people have a lot of preconceptions about what that means. So traditional marketing, mainstream marketing theory is very much about why do people buy product A or product B? So colors and branding and the location on how high an item is on the shelf, all of these things are typical marketing topics. And consumer research is about understanding why people buy things effectively. But over the last 40 years or so, there's been this countercurrent of critical marketing and interpretive consumer research, which is very much about using those ideas, but more for sustainability, equity, pro-animal agendas, and understanding if we can know how to make people buy more things, we can also understand how to make people buy less things, or to make people buy differently, or to make people think about relationships and exchanges and systems of resource allocation much more broadly than markets. So if we think about the traditional market, it's very much market-driven exchanges from corporations to consumers. But there are many different systems of exchange, gifting, for example, sharing. And the market has begun to move towards the sharing economy, the gift economy. And critical marketing is at the forefront of thinking, okay, is this a good thing or is this a commodification of kind of pre-capitalist relationship systems? So it very much takes a much broader view of the economy and tries to situate that within social, cultural, political frameworks. And again, that kind of training in my PhD, because I was trained in critical marketing and interpretive consumer research, that training very much primed me to not be surprised when I began reading about animal studies and began reading about, the legal frameworks which negotiate our relationships to animals, the political mechanisms or lack thereof for animals, the socialization into speciesism and carnism. All of these topics were not surprising to me as a critical marketing scholar. However, this countercurrent is still much smaller compared to the dominant model of marketing. And so there's this kind of David and Goliath relationship there. And I'm trying to work at these boundaries to rework and bring animals not only into my smaller area, because animals have long been ignored in critical marketing. Critical marketing has been very much focused on human imbalances. So I'm trying to bring animals into that first. And then the kind of bigger challenge is to then bring that discussion into the mainstream of marketing theory and practice. So that's a very, very long-winded answer to your first question, but it kind of just sets the scene for what kind of marketing and consumer research I'm doing. And I don't think it's the kind of thing that most people who would be listening to this podcast might immediately think of.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that context. That's very useful. I suppose the other key piece of context to understand this paper, this exploration, is the idea of EDI or DEI, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on, and there's other acronyms as well. This is something, of course, that some people are very, very familiar with. Some people might be familiar with in one context, but not in others. Lots of workplaces have these initiatives, have these conversations, have this discussion of EDI, DEI. What is it from your disciplinary perspective? What is it we're talking about when we talk about DEI?
So I would say DEI or EDI comes from the arguments around justice and social movements generally. But words like justice are very highly charged and obviously politicized. So when we think about the civil rights movement or the suffragettes or the animal rights movement, animal liberation, these are obviously politicized movements in the sense that they want to change power relationships in society. Now, DEI and EDI is a kind of translation of those ideas from the body politic or from society generally into the organizational context. So it began to manifest really in human resources, in human relations theories, in organizational development and design, and obviously in strategy for business. And it was very, very, I guess, again, a countercurrent and undercurrent for many years. And over the last, I would say, probably decade or so, it has gone from being very marginalized and very unknown to being very mainstream. And every organization, until very recently, had to be seen to be pro EDI and pro DEI. So there's this kind of origin in understanding relationships between people within the organization. That's the HR context. It has generalized to strategy, and that's when it entered into my world of marketing. So to break it down, D, E, and I, difference, equity, and inclusion. I quite like the DEI acronym actually, because I think that makes the most sense. So the difference is real or perceived differences between people traditionally. And they can be real in the sense of genetic, or they can be real in the sense of physical abilities and different abilities, but they can also be perceived. So they might be perceived by the individual in terms of cultural, or they might be misperceived. Someone might think that you're different in a way when in fact you're not. And the blurry boundary between the two is really important. So how we perceive people affects how we treat them, which affects actual differences, of course. And actual differences may or may not exist, or may not be latent, but through perceiving them, we can bring them out. So there's this kind of dynamic relationship between the two. There are many categories of difference that we're aware of: sexuality, as I mentioned earlier, gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, and the kind of overlaps and differences between those are debated in various different disciplines. But the species membership boundary is one that has not been considered within the HR context. And that's kind of understandable because obviously HR is human relations or human resources. So it's not that surprising that we haven't thought about the non-human. But I think that's a key problem and something that we should be addressing. Then we go to equity, which there are many different definitions of equity, but just for a simple definition, I equate it with fairness. So equity is about fairly treating people or fair outcomes for people. So they could be structural equity, it could be systems of equity, it could be interpersonal relationships, but it's this idea of fairness, treating people fairly. And if you treat differences fairly, you create a culture, and that culture is what we typically call inclusive. So the word inclusive, again, has many definitions, but for me, it's associated with belonging, it's associated with participation, it's associated with agency or the ability to make choices. And again, when we think of D, E, and I together, that's something that generally everyone agrees on is a good thing. Or at least we thought so until very recently. Of course, there's now an anti-DEI, anti-EDI kind of backlash in the United States particularly, but also elsewhere. So these definitions have been called into question. And for some people, perhaps they don't agree with fairness or inclusion, full stop. But I think in many cases, what we're seeing is a redefinition of, okay, we don't agree with the EDI agenda, but we have our own definition of what fairness looks like. And so there's a really interesting debate around where the EDI agenda is going. And I think there's some fair critiques that EDI and DEI has been kind of sanitized, diluted. It might not always be effective, at least as it's been implemented. But personally, I remain committed to the general ideas that are behind EDI. And this is where we get many other acronyms, because some people say we should reintroduce justice, which leads to JEDI as an acronym. Some people say we should think about dignity. Some people say that rights are part of this. Some people say that they're not part of this. But these contested boundaries as an academic makes this topic interesting for me. And all I wanted to achieve with this particular paper is to bring these conversations to life within my area. The origins from HR moving into more strategy and organizational design then led us into marketing, because of course what businesses are doing within can become a positive reputational advantage, brand value, brand equity building. So then marketing obviously wants to get involved and to promote the fact that this brand is so pro EDI, either within the organization or it's maybe investing in external charities and organizations. So EDI then became a marketing tool. And if we think about what I said earlier with the mainstream marketing, it very much was seen as, okay, how can we operationalize this as an asset for the brand? So we're a pro EDI brand that will attract more consumers. From a critical marketing perspective, we can say, well, we can study things like care washing, greenwashing, pinkwashing, vegan washing, whatever you want to study. But we can also try to kind of save the concept or rehabilitate EDI by saying, okay, what would a truly equitable, inclusive marketplace look like? And this is very much where I am at, and this is what my research is trying to do. If we take EDI seriously and say, okay, what would a truly inclusive, equitable market look like? That would be one that's anti-racist. That would be one that would be feminist in some way, decolonizing, post-colonial. It would be obviously queered in various different spaces and different degrees. And of course, for me, it would also be one that includes animals. And the word including animal, or the phrase including animals, is the one that I think is really, I guess, controversial, but the most interesting one to explore. And I feel like it provides a complementary way of approaching our understanding of human-animal relations, because inclusivity, as it has been kind of translated and retranslated through the lens of business, for better or worse, provides a slightly different rhetoric and discourse than what we typically talk about in animal studies, which is rights, welfare, abolitionism. These are the kinds of very well-established traditions. I don't think EDI is necessarily a completely brand new paradigm, but I do think it sits sort of at odds in very creative ways to these other traditions. And I think exploring that awkwardness could help us move forward as a movement.
Yes, I like this language of creativity, because I think whenever we're trying to bring animals into a new space, a new conceptual space or a new disciplinary space, we have to start thinking in the terms of that space. And so your particular argument for including animals within the EDI agenda, if that's not a loaded phrase, is via the idea of bodies and embodiment. So could you introduce us to this idea of embodiment and show us how that is helpful for bringing animals into the fold?
Well, there's two answers to that. There's kind of a institutional realpolitik answer, and then there's the intellectual, philosophical, theoretical answer. So the first answer is the paper was actually part of a special issue on bodies. So obviously there was a little bit of a bias there in order to skew towards embodiment. But the second answer is when we approach the topic of equity and inclusion with humans, we have many challenges in terms of, obviously, institutions are racist, society is sexist still, there are heteronormative codes in our language. There's lots of things that we have to kind of challenge. But we have one key advantage, which is that the individuals involved that may be disadvantaged have some degree of voice, that they can contribute to the conversation. They can talk about their experiences in interviews, in surveys. They can organize with each other and go on marches and kind of engage in direct action. They have various different avenues available to them. And we as allies or researchers can also engage with them using language. So the language, the shared language, is a huge advantage. If we're trying to bring animals into the discussion, we're at a disadvantage there. Now, obviously, it's a live debate about how animals communicate, whether they have a language, what the definition of language is. I would say, for my purposes, we can say that animals can communicate with each other and, of course, with us in various different ways. But we can also say that they are certainly at a disadvantage when we're comparing human-to-human communication, generally speaking. And so this introduces all sorts of problems around how do we know what's fair for an animal? How do we know what an animal would like? How do we include the animal's perspective in understanding fairness? Is it fair to treat them in a certain way based on our assumptions about how animals wish to be treated? And when we get to the word inclusivity, like I said earlier, inclusivity is associated with belonging. Do animals need belonging in human societies? Do they define it in the same way? If we think about participation, what does participation mean for an animal? Do they want to participate in human societies, or is it better to be removed from that? And if they do participate, what are the mechanisms through which they can do that? So all of the, I guess, elements of these core concepts become very difficult to manage when it comes to animals. So to answer your question, the way I solved this was to effectively sidestep those questions, because those questions are all to do with the mind or the subject or the kind of consciousness. And by focusing purely on the body, at least in this paper, I could sidestep those questions by saying, okay, if we look at animals as bodies at a very basic level, we can reduce the assumptions we need to make progress. Because I think it's not so controversial to say that most animals feel pain and some degree of pleasure. It's certainly not controversial to say that subjecting them to what we do to them in factory farming or in laboratory testing, these are things that generally most people would say are probably likely to inflict pain and suffering of some degree, and therefore is something that the animal probably would not choose, and that they would choose almost any other scenario over that. So there's some very basic assumptions that we make, and yes, they're still assumptions, and if we really want to critically deconstruct them, you might say that, okay, what are the grounds for assuming that an animal doesn't want to be in a factory farm? But I think at a lay level, from a kind of everyday commonsensical point of view, most people would agree that there's a spectrum of debate, and the factory farming case, the lab testing case, is kind of at one end where it's the bad end. And just to move animals into the grey zone where we can maybe get debating around whether they would appreciate a safari or not, if we can get to that stage, I think we've made huge progress. So it's not to disregard those more thorny philosophical issues, but I think from a very practical point of view, the first question we have to ask is, how can we address some of the really clearly not or unfair scenarios and uninclusive scenarios like factory farming? And that's what the emphasis on embodiment allowed me to do, because it kind of removed the mind question, which, now that I say it out loud, it's very converse or inverting the traditional approach that we take in animal studies, which is, we start with Descartes and say that he said that animals don't have mind, and we want to bring mind back into the debate, and we say that animals have mind, they have subjectivity, sentience, and we're kind of fighting against this body-only approach. What I've done here is not necessarily to ignore that, because I do think animals are sentient, but just to say, well, even if we just take that very basic point of view that animals are bodies, we can see that all the stuff that we do to them is not particularly fair. And that kind of allows me to have a very firm base from which to then build my argument.
You started to get into the question of practicalities here, and that was going to be my next question. So when I was reading the paper, I underlined a particular phrase you used, which was a post-human DEI agenda. What might an institution with that agenda look like, or a society perhaps with that agenda look like? What would it look like in practice, I mean?
Well, I think that's my ongoing current research project, is to try to map out in my own mind and then in writing what that would look like. So I don't have firm answers for you, but I do have some illustrative examples of what I think a post-anthropocentric, post-human, more than human DEI agenda might look like. The first one is to include animals in the discussion. So earlier I talked about the thorny problems of the E and the I. So how can we think about equity and inclusion? But the very first step is the difference aspect, which is we just need to appreciate that animals exist, that they have needs, wants, desires, whatever you want to say, and that should be part of the DEI debate. So that's kind of the first hurdle, which is a big hurdle already to jump over. So I think whatever this agenda looks like, it's one that includes animals and takes animals seriously. And then we can obviously have a big discussion around what that looks like, but that's the first step. And I mentioned earlier species, and speciesism is obviously a key construct that we talk about a lot in animal studies. But I think a true post-anthropocentric, post-human agenda would have to think about animal difference in many different ways. So we have subspecies like breeds, for example, or even if we think about chickens in the wild, although I know, of course, not many chickens exist in a wild state, but if we think about various chicken species that have existed, and then the broiler chicken subspecies that now kind of dominates the planet population-wise, these are differences that we might need to think about. So I think we need to move beyond the species boundary as the only thing we're thinking about. And of course, in other disciplines, this is something that's already been addressed, but I think this is something I'm keen to make sure that we address straight away once we import this into marketing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, once we've brought animals into the debate, I think it's really important to think about what fairness would look like. And this is what I've just discussed in terms of, let's start with some really basic ways of defining what unfairness looks like, which I think we can all agree is factory farming and lab testing, maybe very confined zoos. Then we're going to be moving into that grey zone of, is it acceptable, is it fair on the animal to have a safari, even if it's a very open safari where the animal moves freely but humans interact with them? Is that fair if the humans' interaction raises finances that then can be invested in protecting the animal? This is the grey zone that fairness is going to raise. And I think the agenda that I'm setting out would be one where those questions are being asked and that they are considered legitimate questions to ask. But these are questions at the societal level. These are kind of very broad, abstract questions. The practical side then comes, how do we bring that down into our everyday work? So if you're working at a university, what does a post-human university look like? If you're working at an investment firm, what would a post-human investment firm look like? And I would personally think that each of these organizations would have slightly different operationalizations or manifestations of what that would look like. So a practical example, for example, at the University of Manchester, where I'm based, we have a major road that goes through the university campus. Now, for humans, this can be dangerous, but most humans can navigate that road fairly easily. But a lot of animals maybe would be threatened by the amount of traffic that goes down that road, and they don't have a way of crossing the road safely. It's just purely chance if they make it across or not, and a little bit of their instinct. But if we were to create tunnels underneath or bridges over or some sort of way that animals could cross, like they are doing in certain countries at the moment with motorways, this would be a very simple way of creating this more equitable university. And if we had a series of policies like that, perhaps we could think about whether we change working policies to allow you to bring your companion animals into work. If we have this way of crossing the road, if we have more spaces around the university where birds and insects can thrive and be left alone and given autonomy within the space. If we have these various different policies and we add them up, I would define that as an animal inclusive university. It's not to say that every single thing on campus lives in perfect harmony with each other. We know that nature is not so perfect, but inclusivity for me is about belonging and participation, or attempts to move towards those ideals. And so we could imagine the university that's animal inclusive as one where animals are on the agenda whenever we make decisions about what's going on campus, when we make decisions about working practices. We obviously think about the people in our organization, but we also think about the non-humans as persons as well. I tread lightly there because, of course, legal personage is a big debate, but we don't necessarily have to think about people as the defining line there. And the other thing, of course, is we need to think more abstractly. So can a university that serves meat and dairy be considered animal inclusive? Just because all the animals on campus are being treated fairly, if there's these abstract animals in the distance in some sort of supply chain that are being adversely affected, I would not consider that to be equitable for them. And if you look at traditional EDI agendas, they do begin within the organization. They then expand into marketing, and they then expand into thinking about, well, how does the organization affect other organizations and society generally through investing in initiatives or maybe divesting from certain initiatives. And similarly, we're going to have to think about, well, if we're doing lovely things on campus, but we're doing horrible things with the money that we're sending off campus, that's not really going to match up. And I imagine that we'll have these kind of, I don't know what the metaphor would be, but whitewashing, greenwashing, pinkwashing, there'll be some sort of zoo washing metaphor that we need to kind of keep in mind. But these are going to be the questions that I think a university would raise. And then, of course, we can apply that across governments, investments, pharmaceuticals, all of these. And some industries will have different questions or problems than others. At this stage, it's still very speculative. And this is something that I would hope other people would be interested in jumping on board with and helping to develop, because I don't think it should just be my vision.
I do want to stay with this image of the animal inclusive university just before we move on to our regular questions. My question in a nutshell is, do you think we should be optimistic about including animals within DEI? And I was going to use the example of the university. So my school at Loughborough University recently appointed a new associate dean for EDI, and that's Professor Abigail Davis within my school. And she does really important work on minimum income standards, but she doesn't, as far as I know, do any work on human-animal relationships. So just a very practical question. Do you think I should be petitioning her to include animals as part of our school's EDI strategies?
Yes. But the longer answer to that is, this is actually something that I have been working on myself outside of publication. So often when I write a paper, the kind of first question is obviously, can I get it published? And you try and get it published. And then once it's published, the next question is, okay, what can I do with this? How can I get it out into the world? And for academics, obviously, part of that is getting other academics to read it and kind of moving it within academic circles. But for a topic like this, it's something I really want to get into either different kinds of academic circles or into non-academic circles. And so once I published this, I then went to my university, the University of Manchester, and said to the kind of EDI directorate, okay, did you know that veganism is a protected characteristic as an ethical belief, or it can be considered that way? And do we have a vegan network? And the answer was, we didn't think about that, and we don't have a network. So we now have a Vegan Plus network, and it's called Vegan Plus because it's for vegans and people, should we say, on the vegan spectrum of vegetarianism and flexitarianism and so on. So there's some very practical steps that you can take. But of course, that's not really EDI for animals per se. It's EDI for people who think about animals. So there's kind of this indirect, hopefully, benefit for animals if you can promote veganism and other types of beliefs and worldviews and lifestyles and practices that promote animals and their interests. But that's still a step away from including animals in the agenda directly. But I think it's a good stepping stone, because the reason I feel like the EDI agenda, for want of a better word, is a useful way of approaching animal-human relations, and this is what I talk about in the paper, is this is something that's already legitimated within organizations. Organizations either want to do this and have people who are very passionate about these topics, or they feel like they have to do it. And sometimes a combination of the two, right? Sometimes organizations feel like they have to, and there's a few people within the organization who are very authentically behind them. But this is a very legitimated discourse within the UK and elsewhere. Certain countries like the US, of course, it's been challenged. So maybe it will evolve or change in some way, or maybe it will have a resurgence. But where these discourses are established, for example, your university, these are people who are thinking about issues like fairness and inclusion, dignity, justice, and who presumably are very passionate about those. Now, you're still going to have to push against the very heavy door of speciesism, anthropocentrism, and so on. But there should be an open door in terms of pushing against progressive values, equity, fairness, and those kind of things. So I feel like this is a very good avenue to move down in terms of saying, well, you care about diversity in all its human forms. And the reason that discrimination is wrong amongst humans, or one reason, is that discriminating against another human affects a sentient entity, an entity that can feel that discrimination either as pain or loss or grief or anxiety or some sort of negative experience deriving from that discrimination. Or perhaps in a more abstract way, if they're discriminated against structurally, they would have negative experiences in terms of their experience of poverty, for example. But the reason we care about all these differences amongst humans is that there's a shared sentience. That's the kind of moral basis, as far as I understand it, for the DEI agenda. We don't have a DEI agenda for rocks or rivers, at least not at the moment. Of course, some ecocentrists are expanding those arguments, but the sentience, the shared sentience, is a clear base for us to say, well, I care about you because you might be different from me in all sorts of ways, but we have a shared sentience. And that sentience is what makes our treatment of each other moral. And therefore, that's the only thing that should matter, really. And of course, then bringing animals into that debate is quite simple. I don't think it's easy, but I do think it's a more open door than maybe some other areas in which people are trying to get animals included. For example, financial investments is quite hard to include animals in because it's very profitable to use animals. It's not necessarily profitable to redesign markets to include them. Although my future projects are about exploring how can we make these economic arguments for saying, well, there might be anthropocentric benefits as well to including animals in the marketplace. A really practical example of that is, of course, pets. People really love their pets. I mentioned companion animals earlier, but if we stick with the emic term of pet, people love their pet. They care about their pet as if it's a child, a fur baby. And that, again, provides perhaps an avenue for you then to develop conversations around, well, if you love this animal, why wouldn't you love this animal? And we see this a lot in the animal liberation movement. Now, that comes with its problems as well. Like, how do you then deconstruct this kind of hierarchy of love and so on? So I'm not necessarily saying that's the best. But what we see there is that there are already these markets where consumer perceptions and misperceptions about animals is already driving these kind of economic forces. And when you can drive an economic engine towards slightly or greatly more equitable outcomes, the ethical side of things might follow afterwards. So if we think about, for example, whaling, or if we think about horses, the technology came along to displace whale oil before the ethics came along. And the technology came along to displace horsepower with cars. I mean, we still use the metaphor of horsepower, right? So the technology came first, the economic benefits transferred across to the non-animal, and then suddenly the ethics could flourish. And obviously, many people are talking about this in relation to lab-grown meat, for example. I genuinely think the same things could happen with this animal inclusive markets. We need to think about how we can convince people that maybe don't think about animals as much as we do in the kind of animal studies space, but they do think about other things, and they know a lot about those other things, whether it's high finance, whether it's technology, whether it's EDI, and how can we then bring the animal in and say, well, you really care about this, and the reasons you care about this topic are A, B, and C. Well, we can actually line animals up to A, B, and C, maybe in a slightly different way, but in a way that you can hopefully see the parallels. And I think to answer your question in a very long-winded way, I think if we approach universities' EDI schemes, and if we approach corporate EDI schemes and say, okay, well, you've already bought into this general principle, I'm just extending it slightly. Now, I think that slight extension will, of course, be a lot of work. But I think if you try to draw those parallels and to emphasize the similarity and to emphasize actually this isn't a huge paradigm shift from what you've already bought into and what you already believe in, it's actually more of an amendment to what you've already bought into and believe in. I hope that can kind of generate this gestalt shift in thinking of actually, well, okay, actually the animal isn't so different from what I already care about.
Now, Jack, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, I'll try and give some 5 short answers to them.
Do you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I would say the first piece of pro-animal scholarship I ever read was a paper by Shona, Bettany and Rory Daly. It was about companion species consumption. It's in the Journal of Business Research. It was published in 2008, I think, but don't quote me on that. But in that paper, it was talking about how consumers interact with their pets. But the language shift, of course, from pets to companion species, because in this case, dogs had a lot of agency in decision making, and the consumers tried to understand what their dogs wanted and then to kind of build these companion species relationships with their dogs. And that was my first introduction to thinking about animals within my discipline of consumer research. And then from then on, that sparked my interest in kind of delving beyond my discipline. And I would say that the first beyond discipline piece of pro-animal scholarship was Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. So I'm sure you get that a lot. But that was the one. I actually resisted reading it for a very long time because at this point I'd already become vegan. So I thought, well, this is a waste of my time. I'm already kind of converted. Why am I reading about the reasons to go vegan, or at least the reasons to be more pro-animal? But reading that gave me the resources and the kind of emotional, intellectual reinforcement to be able to engage with people who didn't necessarily believe in what I had now accepted. And it's those additional resources that I think are really helpful with pro-animal scholarship.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I would say it was this piece that we're talking about today, because although my previous papers did mention animals, and I think I was moving towards the animal, this was the first piece where I sat down and specifically wanted to write for the animals, and that was core to the purpose of the paper.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
That's very tough. Obviously, I mentioned Peter Singer, but I think I would say it's probably Thomas Regan and animal rights, because I'm more approach animal related issues and human animal relations from a kind of post-Kantian perspective, or a post-human Kantian perspective. And that's just a different podcast to unpack. But I think for people who've only read Peter Singer, I would recommend reading Animal Rights as well, The Case for Animal Rights, because not only is it more a good exploration of the philosophical perspectives and the different philosophical positions, but it also really provides that foundation, which I talk about in the EDI context, of this shared sentience being that unshakable shared basis for moving forward as a progressive movement.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
This is a problem I struggle with quite a lot myself, because I think there's a lot of people in the animal liberation, animal rights, animal welfare movements, obviously all these different overlapping movements. There's a lot of people who are doing things that are much more impactful in terms of redirecting money, creating new products, raising awareness. Academic work is very slow, but I think what we offer that other professions can't or don't is that opportunity to think more deeply and critically, and that space to really unpack some issues. And I think the product that we offer to the marketplace is our ideas. It's the marketplace of ideas. And by creating new ideas or honing ideas, yes, they might be published in very esoteric journals to begin with, but if we can then get them out into the world, these are the viral concepts that people use in their everyday life to either explain why we should care about animals, or to explain to themselves, or to kind of keep the motivation going. All of these concepts might seem very abstract when we write them, but I think when they get out into the real world, they can have a great impact. And there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. I genuinely believe in that and our value as academics.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think it would be a reciprocity. So imagine if every night you went to bed and everything that you had done to other people and other entities in the broader sense, whether they're human, non-human, organic, or otherwise, if everything you'd done to another sentient entity you had to then experience that night whilst you was asleep, I'm sure you would wake up the next day with a very different worldview. And it's this reciprocity that we can, in the real world, we can do things to others that then we don't necessarily get affected by. Now, humans have an ability to be empathetic, so we can, in some way, take on a little bit of that pain or pleasure from someone else and to then reincorporate that into ourselves. And the animal liberation movement really does try to maximize that empathy. But I think if we could somehow magically make our relationships much more reciprocal, I think we would go about our daily lives very differently, thinking about, even if we didn't care about others, we would care for our own sake. And I think that shift would really help to balance behaviors with action.
What are you working on next?
I'm working on trying to really articulate what this animal inclusive world would look like. And I'm working on a concept of animal inclusive markets. Because to go right back to the start, I think people have a very bad view of marketing, which is probably quite well founded in terms of mainstream marketing can be about manipulating and selling more things we don't need. But from a critical marketing perspective, I do think there's an opportunity to use those same systems and tools for better purposes. And I would like to try and work out, given that the market is the dominant model that we all live within, and even people who are opposed to marketing struggle to come up with a viable alternative. So if marketing's the system that we're lumped with for now, is there a way that we can repurpose that to make it more animal inclusive? And what does animal inclusive mean? And how would that manifest in different contexts? And that's bringing me into many thorny questions around what is fairness? Is fairness more important than dignity? Can they come together? Do we need agency? Do animals need to be given agency, or is there some other mechanism? And these are the thorny, interesting questions that I think will keep me busy for the next 5 to 10 years, probably.
How can people find out more about your work?
Well, they can look for me on Google Scholar, but I also post quite a lot on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active. So if you look for Jack Waverley on LinkedIn and give me a follow, I'm quite approachable. So please feel free to drop me a message and I'm happy to chat about the research. They're my two main channels, really.
Well, thanks so much, Jack, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me on X, on Instagram, or on Blue Sky. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.